Good morning. We continue the review and summary of Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We're on page 1467. We've entered into Obir Inyan, the explanation of the Hisbonenus, the contemplation of Achdus Hashem, uniting existence with God, meaning recognizing the utter and total, all-pervasive unity of the divine in existence, not just that God is one, but the only reality. And yet we need to also recognize that God created a world that has an independent consciousness and is everything that it is. So he began to explain about how the process of creation works. The concept of ma'ayin liyesh, isavis ma'ayin liyesh. To appreciate creation, we contrast it with how human beings create things. When we create things, it's yesh miyesh. We take an existing entity, and in that very existing entity, we reshape it, we redefine it, we repurpose it, we even create tremendous breakthrough technologies, but it's still all yesh miyesh. Something exists, and from that, you turn it into whatever it is that we transform it into. Called yesh miyesh il va'ol. Cause and effect. By contrast, as we shall learn, we didn't get back to it yet, creation from God's creation and God, the creator, and the creation of existence doesn't have anything in common like that. So continue to explain that this is the mistake of the philosophers that think that the creation from the creator is also cause and effect. Just like we create things, we take something and create something from it. God also took something and created something from it. Or from himself. Creation is basically an extension of himself. And he gave the classic example of Ilva'ol mahus lemahus, meaning from one entity to another, to the mahus ha'ila nimshach ol, that the very personality of the cause extends itself into the effect. That's yesh miyesh. You take something and you give part of it, you reshape it into something else. So that's from a mahus of the cause to the mahus of the effect. So their mistake is that they think creation is the same thing, that God took a piece of himself, and from that he made something else. We'll soon learn about the creation. So now he goes into the example of seichel and midas. Seichel and midas are like that. They're different entities. There's no question.
Is he referring to Yidden or not Yidden? The philosophy.
It doesn't say. A Jewish philosopher, Al Piteda, wouldn't say this. So when you say philosophers, you're saying something that is based on not Amunas Hashem. It's a misunderstanding of creation. I don't know if he's referring to anyone specifically in the Jewish philosophy, like Meir Nevuchim, you mean, like that? I don't think so. Philosophers generally
not
this.
Not Meir Nevuchim. Maybe Misnagdim.
No, for sure not. No.
Symptom and these things.
No, he's not referring to that. It's a different language. This is like in Perek Beis, the minim and apikursim, where he talks about in the beginning of Perek Beis of Shayichud V'Amunah, that the medame yesh ma'ayin to yesh miyesh. You know what I'm talking about? I think that's more closer to this. Yeah. Okay, so seichel and midas is now the classic example. They're two different entities. You can't compare intelligence to emotions. And yet one has direct impact on the other. Here we're talking about emotions that are born from contemplation. So that's ilav ol, the mahus seichel nimshach ba'ol. And then he explains in the parentheses, I'm just summing up what we've learned so far, that even the seichel is also not a atzmi, it's only ha'ara. So it's not like, let's say, parent to child, where they give the very child the DNA of the parent. Here it's only ha'ara. So from the ha'ara of seichel goes into into the midas. And then he said, he spelled it out. When a person conceives of an idea and he understands it well, and his mind gets excited by it, then afterwards that excitement is transferred over. The midas, so to speak, hear about it from the seichel. So they too get excited. Mispal mizeh. What he says. He says, Aspal sichli, or mispal achakach belev. So what's happening? That the understanding of the idea is now being appreciated and is the reason for the midah, that the midah should also be excited. So it's a different reality. The midah is a different entity, a different paradigm, but it's commensurate to one another. And that's what it means. Now, for example, if the midah got excited, not from seichel, like some says on its own, you'd ask the question, where did it get excited from? What caused it to be excited? And we're not talking now about ingrained and hardwired midah. So here clearly you see cause and effect. One thing is just like you look at something and it causes you to get excited by it. If you didn't see it, it wouldn't impress you. So that's the connection here. They have a commensurate relationship. However, even though it's Eisei Mahus, it comes more b'hakshama. That was the longer parentheses. There's no question in the midah it's much more tangible. And he explained that with a few details. I'll just sum up those details. Because in seichel, it's the etzem, what he says is, seichel yidis atev hadover be'etzem. It's like a conceptual be'etzem, you appreciate something that's good. But you're not saying that's tev li. In the lev, hergesh hatev hadover elov, ech shaloi tev hadover. So that already makes it far more, once it makes it much more relatable, so that means b'hakshama yesed. Hakshama here doesn't mean necessarily yeshes, even though that's also true with midas. It means here that it's coming much more tangible and relatable to you. Not just academically, okay, it's a good thing, and you record that, and fine. So it's teva love. Then he goes also, the seichel, it's not so much behergish, built-in murgish. And meaning you don't really sense it as much. The main thing, you appreciate it. So yes, but you don't feel it and sense it like in a palpable way. And also, he says, and it's bederech mamela the ispilus. You understand it automatically the ispilus. Because you don't have a developed feeling that I want it. So it's not, so he says, Ein bezeh hergish shereitze bezeh la'atzmei. Because it's a good thing, you appreciate it. But for you to go ahead, let's say, and make an effort to go access it, which is when it comes into the heart, that's not there yet. You feel it, and therefore, and you want it. So it's actually, you're being drawn to it. There's an actual, what's happened is that you're consumed with it. In that sense. So what's masanimshach masechel al midas, but then at the same time, what comes from seichel to midas, because this explains, the seichel is different than the midah. Only the b'chinas achreina, the conclusion of the seichel is telling you this is a good thing. But the midah doesn't necessarily have to understand all the details. Le be'etzem hasichli shebezeh. The spilus sichli is midas shebeseichel, and nevertheless, bottom line is, it is going from the seichel to the midas with these qualifications that he pointed out. Now, as I said, I believe we'll understand as we continue what all these details are so important. But I did point out in the last class, the importance is also, it helps us also understand how the seichel of the nefesh habamis, the seichel of the nefesh halikis affects the seichel and the midas of nefesh habamis. It doesn't say that explicitly here. I'm just wondering out loud whether he's referring also to that. But regardless, it's clearly all about an intricate, and you could say the word that I wanted to use is a entangled relationship between seichel and midas. It's not a distant one. The seichel is engaging with the midas, and there's a difference between them, but the mechus seichel ultimately is the driving force. you appreciate something, and therefore your emotions respond to that. And I gave many examples for that in the last classes. That concludes the parentheses. That's where we stopped. So we'll continue. It's about 2/3 of the way down, the line that begins Shenimshach Ba'amidus, and the pages can be found if you want to follow along the text at ayinbeis.com. So then he continues. So this is Seichel to Midas. He's now going to give another example of Il v'Olul, also Seichel, but the example from a teacher to a student. So even though I used that before in explaining this, but now he's going to spell it out. He says, V'chein, hashpos ha-seichel ma-mashpia ala-makabel. The same, similarly, is also when you have a teacher and a student. Mashpia, so there's someone is being transmitting intelligence, an idea, from the mashpia, from the transmitter ala-makabel to the recipient. Hari mahus ha-seichel shel mashpia. The very mahus ha-seichel, the student or the recipient is understanding it. It's not like he's just he's not giving him a physical thing, he's giving him an idea. So he understands it. So from the mahus of the seichel is going to the makabel. If, for example, like we spoke about, if the student had no seichel, God forbid, he wouldn't receive anything. So the student has seichel, the teacher has seichel, he's giving him an idea, he's teaching him something, so it's a mahus, the personality of the seichel is being transferred over. Like he qualified in the last parentheses. Not the full idea as the teacher understands it, it's more like his conclusion, his the way he's able to explain it to the student, because the student is not on the same level as the teacher. The mashpia and the makabel are not on the same level, but it is seichel. He's not like giving him nothing. He's giving him a tangible, a real, I don't want to use the word tangible to confuse it with the word before, hargosha, akshama, but he's giving him a seichel. However, it's bechinas achreina, meaning it's not the whole depth of the teacher. So he says, that's extended and that it's transmitted to the makabel. And the student, after the recipient receives it, he now has it, meaning it's become part of who he is. And now it's become part of the seichel of the makabel. So it's not like something that remains the teacher's ownership. He's transferred over an idea, explained it to the point that the makabel now has become his seichel. That's another example for a mashach of muhus lemuhus. There's something of the very entity, the personality, or it's not a reflection of the seichel, it's the seichel itself. Even though it's the chinas achrena, that has now become muhus lemuhus, become part of muhus ha-seichel of the makabel. So it's a second example like seichel and midas. Here, maybe a little more relatable because we can actually see student and teacher. Mashpia makabel. Va'ayim mashin is boyer le'il. He's telling us to look and delve into what we learned earlier. Dibra masel ve'idaber Moshe al roshi hamatis ha'alef. So the mimer from Mate is back from volume 1, as they cite down below, page 68, Samaches. I don't recall what it says there exactly, but clearly it must discuss this topic. So all this, so even though we're talking about intelligence, which is more sublime than a physical material item, nevertheless, in the manner, the way it's transmitted, it's like the hashpah in Gashmis from a yesh to yesh. So classic example, a wealthy person is helping someone who's poor. He's giving him money or food or whatever. He doesn't say specifically what he's giving him, but he's giving him something of material value. He's not giving him a reflection of something. He's actually giving him the very entity. Let's say it's $1,000, $500, a penny, food, or something. He's giving him a mahuz davar. So Gashmis is very clear. Yesh mi yesh. It's yesh mi yesh. Now, those seichel compared to a physical item, you don't call it purely a yesh, but it is also a yesh. It's an entity, and that entity has been transferred over, just like, however, it's in the world of seichel. It's not the world of materialism, meaning not a piece of matter, a tangible piece of matter. It's seichel. And the same thing from teacher to student, from mashpia to makabel, and the same thing, like you said before, seichel to midas. So this is all called yesh miyesh, ilav va'olul, mahus lemahus. All this is going to be vital because it's going to be now contrasted in a few lines with how God creates existence and the mistake of the philosophers. So now another parenthesis. So also when a person gives tzedakah, we know there's also a ruchnisdika element. Like we say, the Rambam says there are levels of giving charity. You can give someone something and just and that's that. But there's the concept shavu amafaise. When you give something and you also comfort someone, you give them encouragement. You do it with a smile. So that is not a physical transmission, meaning like the coin or the money you're giving them, but it's hashpah ruchnius, relatively speaking. Where is that coming from? It's coming from the light, from the energy of his heart, the empathy and care, where he's comforting someone. So like he says in the Ram, you could also give tzedakah without saying anything to someone. You can give with a sour face too, or neutral. But here, it's coming from his heart. So it's also hashpah. So that too can go into this category. It's hamshacha from the muhus, the very personality of the kindness within his heart, within the usher, within the giver's heart, which lifts up the spirits and uplifts the morale, the spirits of the ani, of the poor person. It's interesting, like it says elsewhere, how the Rebbe Rashab is going to lengths to really explain muhus l'muhus, yesh miyesh. Like you could ask, why is this so relevant? You already said yesh miyesh. You're giving someone, you're helping someone in a physical way. He spoke already about more sublime ways through seichel, but in tzedakah too, he also wants to say there's the mafaise. I would like to believe that all these details are relevant to the whole discussion. It's not just some type of a tangential comment, since he's talking about the physical and just wants to qualify and say, just know that there's also a transmission of something more sublime, something more subtle, like in this case, more ethereal, maybe is the right word, than mafaise. But we'll see if we can figure that out. Okay.
How are you translating Hamaphiso? Who?
I said comfort.
Yeah.
Comfort, it can be also encouragement. Matthias sometimes means to appease, but here he doesn't mean to appease. He's trying to say he's giving someone and telling them things will be good. Give them, like he said, hagbah. He's lifting up the spirit. So clearly it's that type of, I would use the word comfort. Even though you could say comfort is menachem, is nachama, but that's how I would say. The Rambam, when the Rambam says mafaise, usually means, mafaise is a form of, like we say, mafais, even with Hashem and davening. It's like a type of like showing empathy, really.
Thank you.
Okay, so he concludes now. The b'chol zeh, all the above, this last really 3/4 of a page, yesh beis dvarim. What do we conclude from this? There are two things. That number one, there's a commensurate, there's a proportionate relationship. The erech, v'ishtavus, a commonality between the effect and the cause. Let's say, take the seichel of the, seichel and midas. What's the commonality? That the seichel, the midah is appreciating what the seichel is appreciating. So there's something in common. It's not two different universes. The mashpia the makabel is the seichel that's transferred from the transmitter to the recipient. Usher and ani, whether it's the money or it's the pius, the comfort, something's transferring over. There's something commensurate. For example, to say you're going to be matthias and evan, a stone. A person is going to comfort a stone. There's no common denominator. There's no sofa mishutefet, as they say. There's no common denominator, no commonality between them. So all these things indicate a commonality. What he calls erech and ishtavus. Erech means like a proportionate, commensurate, and ishtavus is a commonality, something meshava, something equal about them, even though one may be on a higher level than the other. Okay, the ma'achesh shuam shochesh shem mehusei, and he's explaining why. Being that he's not just giving a off something that is not from his very personality, it's coming from his very essence. Or again, I want to stay away from the word essence because he used before the word etzem and said seichel is a ha'ara, not a etzem, but it's the mehus ha-seichel. So since he's giving behesses, behechrech sheishtava be'erech zelazeh. Again, like I just gave an example with a human being and a stone. You can't communicate to a stone. Yes, they have something in common. They're both creations in that sense. But I'm talking about in the context of transmitting something. But being that it's mumuhusei, so it's be'erech sheishtava, behechrech sheishtava be'erech zelazeh. That's ilav olu. That's cause and effect. Beis, what's the second thing that we find in all these examples of yesh miyesh and ilav olu? Hushini v'ispailus b'ha'ila. So it's not just something that they have some common denominator, but there's also a shini v'ispailus in the cause. It's not aloof and detached. The mohus of the seichel, the teacher has to apply himself. You can't say the teacher is not affected by his transmission. And the same thing with the Osher and the Ani, and the same thing with Seichel and Midas. There's a Shina in Espailas by Ila, Ben Kedem Ashpa or Be'es Ashpa. From before he started transmitting and the time he's transmitting. So right now, a teacher who's not teaching a class, so obviously he's in one place, but now that he's applying himself to teach a student and give over to Makabel, clearly there's a Shinui in him. Now, of course, these two elements are interconnected, because if it wasn't mahus mahus, if there was nothing in common, maybe there wouldn't be a shinui, as we're soon going to learn. But bottom line, he wanted to establish that when he's talking yesh miyesh, you have to say mahus mahus, that there is, number one, something in common, and number two, that there's a shinui in the ilah, in the cause, as resulting from the cause effect turning into impacting the effect. That's the conclusion. So now he still has to get back to what's the mistake of the philosophers? So why can't you say the same thing to God and creation? Now you can of course start guessing and speculating, but the Rebbe Rashab is going to spell it out. But before we start the next paragraph, in this contrast, any questions? I immediately had a question, but I know the Rebbe Rashab is going to answer it later. So I'll just point this out before, in case anybody's thinking about it. Let's take this. What about the sun and planet Earth? The sun is being mashpia light and warmth to our Earth. Is it muhus lemuhus? And is there a shinui and espalus in the sun? There's a shinui and espalus in the sun. We know for sure not, because the sun gives off light, and it makes no difference if it's a cloudy day, or if the light is shining over a palace or shining over a garbage pile. Doesn't affect. But there you could say, because it's not mahus, because it's only the light of the sun. The sun is not giving a piece of itself. If the sun was saying, let me impart a piece of the sun, I'm talking about a physical piece of the sun, whatever the sun is made of, not just a reflection of it, and that was transmitted in some way, whatever. Let's say a piece of the sun breaks off like an asteroid and hurtles toward the earth. That would be a whole different story. Then it's a muhus lemuhus. And yes, the sun, number one, there's something in common because the sun is giving a piece of itself. And number two, there'd be a shinui in the sun because a piece of it is missing. I'm not saying it's going to be lacking light. I'm just throwing that out as an example. Whereas when you're giving seichel, even though you could say the seichel of the teacher is also only a ha'ara, the teacher is not lacking seichel after he gives it, but it does cause a shinui in him because he has to apply himself. He's not just there sitting in the room and light is shining from him. There is an application, and there's the commonality. I think he's going to talk about actually the sun a little later, that example. But I just wanted to point out that here he's clearly talking about yesh mi yesh, muhus le muhus. Even if the muhus is a ha'ara, like he said, seichel, but we're talking about the ha'ara itself is carrying over. Seichel is ha'ara compared to the etzem hanefesh. So the etzem hanefesh would be compared to like the sun in this case, and the seichel is like a reflection. But the seichel itself is, the seichel is being imparted to the student, or to the makabel, to the recipient. Definitely so with the usher and the ani. That's not even a question. So I guess when it's more sublime thing like seichel or mefaisei, the comforting, it's not quite as tangible as you can really touch it and say, here's the thing, I'm giving you now $1,000. So I guess for the usher may not be a lot of money, but he is giving him something, substance. Okay, so now bottom line is, let's continue. He's going to now contrast this and go back to creation itself. Bri yesh ma'ayin. And this is going to be the distinction between how some of the philosophers understood creation, with God being the yesh harishin. Just for the record, Rab Shlomo asked me which philosophers. Most likely he's talking about Aristotle, because he's the one that said God is the first cause, the Motzei Rishon like. But first cause, where there's something still in common. And Chassidus talks about it. They don't always bring him by name, but he's one of the classic philosophers that believes in a God, but a God that still has, it's not the way we'd understand God. So that may be very likely when we say philosophim, mean the Greek philosophers. I'm not going to say it with definitively, but it's clearly part of what they talk about, and it's the Meir Nevuchim discusses the Aristotelian perspective, but there are distinctions, obviously. So we also believe Motzei Rishon, God is the first cause, but the question is, what kind of cause is it? Is it a yesh mi yesh, mahus le mahus, like he said, ilav olol, or not? I will say one more thing in that context. We also know with the Ramak, lo yoda meaning not simsum. So Ramak also sometimes Chassidus says understands shtalshlus in a form of ilav olol. But Chaz v'shalom to say that the Ramak feels that the Eibishter is something in common with us is just the process of how he creates. We'll talk about that more later. I want to see how he contrasts it, and then we can figure out more about what philosophical perspectives the Rebbe Rashab is negating here. So, a new paragraph, let's continue. And again, for the record, a lot of this text is straight word for word from the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, Hamagbiel L'Sheves. I have it marked actually on my pages here, so I could see which are actual lines from the. The next section, most of it is Mittler Rebbe with some additions. The previous paragraph, only the first 4 lines, and later one line about the Ani and the Usher are from the Mittler Rebbe. The rest is the Rebbe Rashab. But here it starts like this. V'ef shalemer, says the Rebbe Rashab now. We cannot say kedug mezu l'maylo. Everything we just discussed about yesh mi yesh, ilivol, the 2 key points, that there's something in common among them, and there's a shinu and ispilus, and an effect and impact on the ilah, on the cause, as it transmits to the effect. You can't say that l'mayla me'isavas hanivroim ha'beirius baruch. When we're talking about from the creation of all creatures, from the Creator, you can't say that. That there's an erech, there's something commensurate and proportionate between the beira and the nivra. Nivra, from the nivra to the beira, and ishtavus, and something in common. You can't say that. Cannot. Because they're infinitely distant and apart. There's nothing in common among them. The only thing in common is that one was created by the other, but nothing that is in common. The Creator, the blessed Creator Yisbarach, is in a state of infinity, ubilti bal tachlis, without any parameters. Tachlis can mean purpose, but here means tachlis doesn't mean no beginning, no end. And the creation is finite. It's a finite creature. in all ways, whether in kamus or in echus, is defined by parameters. That's what a creation is. There's no creation in existence that does not have gvul. Even if you talk about the worlds, they may have elements that God embedded in them, but on their own, they're essentially defined by their finite parameters. The imoye be'erech, and if they were indeed commensurate to one another, erech meaning something proportionate, so basically, if there was something be'erech, then the nivra should also have some element of infinity. A bilti balgvul really translated does not mean infinity. It means without any limits, without any finitude, I think is the word, or finitude. So that's the first thing. Before we spoke about there is an erech and ishtabus. You can't say that, but what about item number 2? Shinei and ispilus, effect and impact. V'gam lo yesh shum shinei v'ispilus klal me'in ha'isavus. And the same thing with the second item. There's no change and there's no shift. Hispilus doesn't always mean excitement. Hispilus means completely, the word completely, I don't want to say the word oblivious is obviously not the right word. But there's no shin, there's no, I'd say no change and no effect would be the right word. Impact. Me'in eisavus. How do we know? K'moshe kosev ani Hashem lo yishanisi. It's a clear passage. God do not change. Unchangeable. Immutable is the word we've been using back a while back. Now I know you may ask the question, what about Avodas Hashem? Does that have an impact on Hashem? So be patient, that we will discuss. He's going to discuss it later. We already learned about it, but fundamentally God is unchanged and unaffected, immutable. So both items that we said, both rules of erech and ishtavus, commonality and commensurate, and the second thing, shinei spirals that we said before, yesh b'yesh, does not apply when it comes to creation and creator. Va'atuhu kedem shenivro elam, va'atuhu la'achar shenivro elam. The expression is, you are as you were before you created the world, and you are atohu, the same ato, after you created the world. Bli shum shinei klal. No change at all. So our whole creation, our whole existence, with all its machinations and all its complexities, from God's point of view, nothing changed. God in no way changed as a result of it. Because the Isabas was not muhus l'muhus. God did not, it's not God in a sense, it's not a piece of him. It's not from muhus muhus. Hainu muhus alakus liyas muhus hanivroim. That the muhus of alakus, the personality of godliness and divinity, to the muhus of nivroim. They don't have anything in common in that sense. Now, of course, you're going to say, what about the nitzutz alaki, the divine spark, or the divine words? But those are all energy, that the creative energy invested, that's creating it. But the creation itself is something that is not a piece of godliness. It's only coming from the light and the reflection of Elikus Levad. Now, this, of course, is a fundamental piece in Chassidus. We always talk about Eir Ein Sof, that it's Eir Ein Sof where the Tzimtzum took place. It's Eir Ein Sof that is involved in the process of creation. And Eir does not affect the Moir, the source of Eir. So basically, even though everything is coming from God, but the way he does it is in a way that he's not being affected like a teacher and a student, or Seich Lamidis, Muhus L'Muhus, like he said. And again, of course, the question right away arises, what about a neshama? Chelik elikam emal mamish, we say. Tzelem elikim. So again, all these things I would wait, because right now he's talking about pure creation. He's not talking about God then infusing something with his own godliness. That's another story. And even then, the question is, does that create a shin in ispilus? Is it muhus lemuhus? We'll talk about that. But right now he's talking about purely creation. Look at existence, the world. And we're talking about the world that was created, the 6 days of creation, We're not talking about anything else beyond that. There, it's not like the yesh miyesh of let's say a osher and a ani, a wealthy person, a poor person, like you said before, a teacher and student, or seichel and midas. V'hu shenikra, and this is what it means when we say hamshacha zu, and this is what is called this hamshacha that we're discussing of creation, b'shem ayin liyesh, lo miyesh liyesh. This is called from ayin to yesh, not yesh to yesh. As I said before, yesh to yesh, no matter how powerful and how breathtaking it may be in the creations of technologies that human beings have done, it's at the end of the day, you're taking the yesh of existence and you're reshaping it and repurposing or accessing or tapping into it. So yes, it's amazing things what we've done. When I say we, human beings, scientists, science has done. But at the end of the day, it's a yesh to yesh. They did not create something out of nowhere. Electricity was always there. Atomic energy was always there. We didn't know about it. Then we discovered it. Then we learned how to tap into it. Again, tremendous. Medical breakthroughs and so on. That's a world of itself. Yesh miyesh. But everything in the context of creation that he's saying here, yesh ma'ayin. Like I said a number of times, we spoke about, a scientist can tell you, once I know the yesh, it was a big bang, I can then try to extrapolate and try to theorize what happened afterwards. How those gases developed, how they evolved, and ultimately planets, however they explain the world. That's fine. Whether we agree with everything, whether everything is correct, that's subject to scientific discussion. But a scientist, if you ask them, where did that first ball of gas come from? There's speculation. They have nothing that you and I don't have. All the knowledge in the world cannot take them from the world from yesh to ayin. There you need some other type of information. And it's not measurable. And you can't put it under a microscope. You could theorize. The most they could talk about is yesh miyesh. Because that's what they're working with. And the most they should talk about, frankly. Because even a munah of a scientist is not necessarily his science. His science teaches him there must be something more. And he accepts that. So yesh ma'ayin is the domain of another reality that has nothing in common with our reality and that put this reality into place. That's why we call it yesh ma'ayin. Important to emphasize this because not every mimer always spells it out. You know, people say yesh ma'ayin, they throw out creation ex nihilo or something from nothing. Not really nothing. It means nothing in the context, not a yesh, something from a reality that has nothing in common with the something. That's the real way to translate yesh ma'ayin. Not something from nothing, something that has nothing in common with that something. Everything we see in this world, you can trace to a source. You see a little fire, you know the fire came from somewhere. You see water, it came from somewhere. A child tells you there's a parent. A parent tells you that parent was a child of a parent before. A tree came from a seed. The seed came from a previous tree. Everything is yesh miyesh. Everything. You know, the classic joke they tell about the scientist who says to God, we don't need you anymore. We got everything you can do, we can do. So God says, show me. Scientist goes into his laboratory, takes a clump of earth, puts it on his table, and starts playing around with it. And he's going to say to God, you'll see how I'm going to make something grow from this earth. So of course, God says to the scientist, hold on a second. Why don't you use your own earth? That the scientist forgot about. He's taking God's earth that has properties, whether we understand or not how they work, and he's showing, okay, now with those properties, I can do it not in the field, I can do it in my laboratory. But try to do it without earth. Try to make a tree grow without any earth. Now, maybe today they can create synthetics and so on, but it's always going to be some form of yesh miyesh. Bottom line is, yesh ma'ayin is a whole different reality. And it's critical because you could also argue what's wrong to say that God created yesh miyesh. So a lot of problems with that, of course, because then since God has something in common with us, so why is God? You could say, okay, God is my teacher. He's my principal. He's my superior. But he's not completely beyond me. So I'm also in existence. As we're going to learn, this is very relevant to the levels of bittul and yichud and so on. Because ultimately, all this is coming to explain Yichud. Remember, Yichud, Yichud Yichud Tata. But bottom line right now, he's making the comparison and separating between Yesh Miyesh and Yesh Ma'ayin.
Can you take a question?
1 minute. Let me just make sure that I'm finished what I want to say. And then I'll take many questions, as I always do. Let's see here. So this is what's called Lo Yesh Miyesh. Yeah, let me read a few more lines. V'hainu, the b'chinas ha'oris v'ziv zeh ein a nechshev memuhusa l'kuz klal v'klal. So Yesh Miyesh, obviously the first Yesh and the second Yesh, because they have something in common, they also so-called have to recognize each other. There's something of some commonality among them. Here, creation is coming from a v'ziv, a light and a reflection. So it's not nechshem memhus elikus klal v'klal. It's not anything you can say this is a piece of or from the essence or the personality of elikus. God created it, absolutely, and God maintains His creation, is constantly energizing and creating it. It has nothing from the etzem, not like the seichel of the student does have from the seichel of the teacher. It's only, now he calls it ziv v'hoid. These are more or less interchangeable words. Reflection and hoid is also a form of reflection that radiates from the etzem. That's infinitely apart compared to the etzem, nothing in common. And both points he's making again. One is there's nothing in common, and it doesn't cause any change or effect or impact in the etzem. That's Yesh Ma'ayin. Then he's going to start with examples and continuing. I'll stop here for any questions.
Right. So my question is coming to talk about the words yesh, from yesh to yesh, from ayin to yesh, and just how those words developed in Chassidus, because it takes the how shall I say, the uninitiated, the unlearned, quite some time to get these concepts down, because we also know that the ayin or the ain is actually the yesh amiti, and the true ain is the yesh hanivra. So there's these words are so difficult to translate, because the true reality is God. He's the only real yesh, and our reality is we're comprised. If to the extent we exist, we're comprised of Him. So that's question one: is how these words came about in such a way that it becomes difficult unless you already understand it to be able to translate. That's question one. Question two is, if you want to talk about from yesh to yesh, I mean in a literal sense, in terms of etzem to nivra, to the extent you can. I understand he just said you can't, but what really is a mispal, what really gets a rise out of the neshama, that sparks the transformation of the nefesh Bahamas, is dafka, the connection, the relationship between the etzem of the neshama and atzmus itself, because we're chelek elokam mamish. Now we're not atzmus, but we have a chelek. We're a derivative of it, and I would suggest that
you didn't hear me ask that question before.
Maybe you did, but I'm bringing it up. No,
it's not. I said we'll discuss it later, so I'm not going to discuss that now. That's a whole different. That's because God chose to do that. We're talking about creation now, the process of creation.
And what about the verbiage? Like, what do you have to say about how? Like,
to me, it's very simple. Yesh ma'ayin, yesh miyesh is not first of all a chiddush from Chassidus. We're talking about creation here. What you're doing is not just processing, you're doing ultra processing, because you're bringing ideas that you've learned elsewhere. And so sometimes have to just go back to the beginning. And that is creation and God have something in common or not? Let's ask that question. The answer is no. Now, can God infuse creation with godliness and godly sparks and His purpose? Obviously, He created the world, but creation itself, the world itself, whether it's the sun or the moon or the earth, or anything in Daimim Semeach Chaim Medaber, or anything that in existence, the first thing we need to know, it's a completely created entity that did not exist before Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'saaretz. Yesh ma'ayin is actually first expressed. The Ramban uses those words. That's called yesh ma'ayin. It's bara is a unique word in Hebrew. No one creates except God. Everything we do is yesh miyesh. That's the most basic thing. You've learned about a concept called yesh amiti. So you're asking the question, which is fine. I'll respond to that. But just remember, that's the point here. Everything that we in existence, we shape from one thing to another. Nobody can come right now, sit down, and say, Yehi oir, and suddenly, poof, there'll be light. Yehi rakia, there'll be rakia. It doesn't exist, that possibility. A human being cannot do that. No, not only a human being, nothing in existence can do that. So existence is all about a yesh reshaping itself, even in marvelous and as I said, breathtaking ways. Yesh ma'ayin is a domain of the creator. He created something that has nothing in common to the source, which means that you can't trace it and say, okay, here, the seed is the source of the tree. I trace it back to the seed. The seed I trace back to another tree, back to another seed, etc. Here, there's a certain leap, a quantum leap from yesh to ayin. What does ayin mean? Like I said, not nothing, completely different reality. It has nothing in common with the something, the yesh. Now, the concept of yesh amiti, so Chassidus says, when you're talking from God's perspective, what is the true reality is God. There, yesh has a very different meaning. It doesn't mean existence and reality as we see it. We're talking about existence and reality as we see it. So we call ourselves the yesh, and someone will say, where did this yesh come from? Where did the Big Bang, where did the first ball of gas come from? The answer is, that's a complete unknown. It's a different reality. So ayin is from the perspective of the yesh. And Chassidus says, if you're talking from God's perspective, then God is the true yesh, and everything else is ayin, is nullified in its presence, as we learned at length a number of times.
So in some sense,
So it's not about, I mean, the word yesh here and yesh here completely have nothing in common.
no, of course.
It's just a question of what you're calling reality.
I understand, and I get it. I just wanted to hear you elaborate, which was very helpful. But because of what you just said, it seems like, in general, the terms we speak on, I don't mean, we certainly on this page of this daf of Ayin Beis, but bichlal, the way we talk, we speak in the language of Das Tachton, and this idea of yesh ha'amiti, that God is only true reality, and that is the language of Das Elyon. Yes.
So what's the question?
No, I just find it fascinating that once you clarify the perspective, everything falls into place.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so we'll stop here. It's a good place to stop. We're 2 lines from the bottom of page 1467. And as I said, regarding the Neshama, Chelik Elikam, Mal Mamish, and other elements where you say God gave so-called Chelik Elikam, what that means, in context of what we're saying, keep in mind, you wouldn't call that Nivra. You wouldn't call that Nivroim, because there God is saying, after I created existence, I'm now going to vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim. God says, I will now breathe a part of myself. So that he's adding something into creation that he wanted to add, obviously, in order to help change creation. So we'll talk about that as well, and how that affects and so on. Here he's talking about clearly just the concept of creation. And remember, again, it's all coming to explain the yichud of Yichud Tata, Yichud Ilah, of Shema and Baruch Shem and Hashem Echad, etc.
Yeah, that's why I brought up. That's why I brought up Das Elyon and Das Tachton, because we're going there. So we
yeah, but but look, since I'm teaching the class, I understand you want to partner with me in it, but
no, I'm just excited. That's all. I'm not. God forbid. God forbid.
No. My point to say is it's being paced, and he will talk about all this as we move along. But yes, that's correct.
I would never purport to stand in your shoes. God forbid.
I didn't mean it that way. I meant to say that I'm pacing it more and processing as we go along.
I understand. Okay.
Okay, good. So we stop here. Are there any other questions?